There's been a lot of talk lately about pyramids. There's a claim that there are these massive structures that were discovered underneath the pyramids. But apparently, those claims are suspect due to the reputation of the people making the claims, and apparently there's really no major substantiating evidence for any of it. Who knows? But interestingly and coincidentally, I've been thinking about pyramids a lot lately. And the claim that some people are making about these supposed structures under the pyramid is that they could be an indicator that the pyramid was some sort of a power station. Indeed, even Ken Wheeler was speculating about that rather emphatically. So it sounds like he believes that this is the case, but I have my doubts. We'll see, or we won't. But the way that I've been thinking about the pyramid is as a symbol of power. Indeed, we've been hearing the phrase pyramid power, if you can call two words together a phrase. We've been hearing that for many, many years. And I think it's a very effective symbol of power. And so I made a video about it. But I want to say a couple of things before I go into that video, which is a little bit rambling because, as usual, I'm just kind of formulating the ideas. I have kind of a general picture usually, and then I sort of start to talk about it, and I don't have time to refine presentations. So one of the things I want to talk about is the idea of inversion, which is a key concept in Taoism, and it's also one of the key elements of the trigram theory. I think it's a key aspect of nature. Things get to a point where they have to go the other way. And so we could say that for much of history, perhaps the correct way of looking at the pyramid is in this orientation, but what I'm going to suggest in this presentation is that really this is more the direction that we should think of the pyramid power. And I'm going to make the claim, or I'm going to postulate, that when you're climbing up a hierarchy, you're actually descending down. And on some level, I think that that's just so obviously true. All we have to do is to take a look at our leadership. Now, it may not be the case in other nations. I imagine that at certain points in history, the best would ascend to the top. But I think it's pretty clear, in a world where, let's say, as a shorthand, only the people who go through the Epstein treatment are allowed to enter the top positions. I mean, come on, right? And I think this represents something else as well. When in its ordinary position, the pyramid appears to be reaching up towards the heavens. I think it's very reasonable to see that, or to have that sense that as you are climbing upward into a more rarefied space where there's fewer and fewer, in essence, right? Rarefied, as I understand it. Well, let's just check and make sure, but see, isn't this great? Yeah, rarefied. Lower pressure. So it's thin. There's less molecules there, right? So fewer entities around you. Down at the base, there's a lot, right? But up here, very few. So I think in, let's say, the classical sensibility, there would be the few at the top would be of the most admirable kind. However, what we have done is essentially been Earth-oriented. In other words, godless. And so we are focused on our rapacious exploitation of what's on Earth. So you could think of this point here as plunging down into the planet. And I actually spent a fair amount of time trying to get Grok to make an image that would express that. And I couldn't get it to do it, but I took something that was relatively close to it. Now, we'll talk about this light cone here on the top, because I'm going to make a distinction between the pyramid and the cone. But we're going to start with the pyramid, and the pyramid is plunging into the planet. It's fracturing it, right? That's kind of what we're doing. That's what power is doing now. Those at the I'm going to say the highest levels of power, but really they've descended to the lowest depths of hell. And they're dropping bombs on the planet. And they're just rapaciously ripping resources out of it and disturbing the ecosystem, you name it. Flooding the world with chemicals that we have no clue what the consequences are. Not to mention the electromagnetic ray. I mean, everyone knows, right? It's obvious. We're just doing crazy stuff. And we know that a lot of it is very damaging. And then there's a bunch of other stuff happening that we know could and probably is extremely damaging. And yet that's what the most powerful people on the planet are doing. And okay, let's put it within a historical context. They're doing it because the competition in the original condition became so intense that more and more malevolent games had to be played in order to hold your group together. So you could say that there's a Byzantine quality to civilization in the sense that there was ever more complication, ever more hidden subterfuge, diversionary tactics, and then outright malevolent undercutting, covert action, like just the multipolar trap. It's where you have a bunch of competitors at a table. This is a game theory. It's not a theory. It's the way the world has gone. You have a bunch of players at the table, and there's a set of rules for the game. And one player decides not to play by the rules in order to gain an advantage. And this forces everyone else to also break the rules. They may break different rules. And so the rules essentially just keep eroding. And the behavior becomes more and more outrageous. And isn't that precisely what we're seeing? So I think that this more accurately represents the position of power. And with that, let's see what I said in that previous video. There's going to come a moment where I start to get a little bit stuck thinking about this shape. And so I'm going to say that the counterforce to this downward facing diabolical satanic pyramid power is a light cone. And I'll describe why I think that's a good model. But the question is whether or not these two things are always in some kind of an interaction with each other, or if there are, let's say, different stages where you would have, they don't really, they meet at the base, let's say, but there's no real interaction between the two. And maybe that seems like a fine point, but I think really what it brings into question is there ever any period of civilization where things are all dark or all light? Isn't it always some kind of mixture of the both? And could you have one without the other? You know, the idea of the enlightened, philosopher kings, was that ever a real thing, or is that just sort of an ideal? And is this light cone merely a representation of an ideal that on Earth gets converted into this kind of demonic force, or rather is in interplay with the demonic force necessary in order to survive? My hunch would be it's more like this than like this. I think that everyone dreams that somehow or another we would leave this demonic system of civilization behind, and then we would form some kind of enlightened civilization without any of the negative side effects. But that just seems like such an obvious fantasy, right? So, and really when it comes down to it, this is not a very compelling shape. I mean, just on a geometric basis, I'm not convinced by this. I mean, that's total silliness, but come on, this is a pretty cool shape. Look at this thing. It's pretty wild. So in this video that I'd made previously, the graphics were not as good. I was just starting to toy around with it. But, maybe I'll insert a few other graphics. We'll see how much time I end up spending on this. Here we go. So, obviously, the pyramid has been used as a symbol for a long time for the hierarchy of power. And I don't want to bore you with the obvious, but clearly there's the largest number of powerless. And as you work your way up in power, fewer and fewer, and theoretically, it meets at one point. Now, before we start to describe some of the dynamics involved in the relationship between different positions of power, let's talk about the pyramid itself. And you will note that it has 4 sides and that the base is square. So it's not a platonic solid because it has a different shape at the base. Why is it square in the base? We can think of this in terms that are Taoist. The Taoists say that Earth is square and heaven is round. The pyramid is reaching up towards heaven. And you could say that those who assume positions of power are trying to leave the earth. And indeed, we see quite specifically that the richest people in the world are literally trying to leave the planet. So to get up off of the earth, to be free from... Now, why is the earth square? What does that actually mean? So think about what square suggests. Square has a corner. And a corner is a place where you can get stuck. And no matter which way you turn in a square, you're faced with a corner. You're boxed in. That's life. At some point or another, you're done. You're boxed in. There's nowhere to move. You've made all the moves you can make. And then you're done. That's what it's like on Earth. What's it like in heaven? Well, it depends on what you mean by heaven. Now let's place this within the context of the Bagua. Heaven occupies two very different positions in the prenatal and the postnatal. In the postnatal, the position is in the northwest. In other words, it's close to the bottom. Prior to water. That's an obvious inversion with respect to the prenatal, where heaven is in the southerly position. The emperor always faces south. That means that the emperor is always looking towards heaven. What does it mean to have heaven in the northwest? It means to be looking in the wrong place for it. You're looking to the earth. You're looking into the earth for heaven. You're trying to make heaven on earth. What this represents is a misguided idealism trying to be applied to life on earth. It's ideology trying to be realized in the actual world, which does not operate on the basis of ideology. That's why ideology always skids off the rails, because it's essentially incompatible with reality. And this, of course, is the tendency of power. The dream is that everything will come to a point. And how do we represent a point? With a circle. So the non-dimensional point is confused by the representation of the circle, because you cannot represent a non-dimensional entity. You can only experience it. Consciousness is that non-dimensional entity. It pervades the universe, and yet we cannot put our finger on it. It is the being within phenomena. And that being is probably a unity. And the phenomena are constructions around that being that pervades everything, where the being can have a momentary sense of separateness. It's like the droplets of water in crashing waves. You have one ocean that is essentially a field of consciousness, and then that consciousness becomes enclosed in, let's say, membranes, a barrier, some kind of separation. So the droplet of water briefly separates from the ocean so that it can see things, in essence, so that it can have an experience. So in a certain sense, it can see itself. This is solving a problem. It's solving a problem for unitary consciousness. Unitary consciousness without experience would have no bearings. So it creates distinction and separation so that it can have some kind of sense of what it is and what's going on. Without distinction, you can't know anything. There's just being. So in trigram terms, that would be earth, very confusingly, because of course I'm making a distinction between heaven and earth here, and yet I'm saying that what I'm saying is that the state of being closest to heaven is actually that of earth, which in some certain sense makes perfect sense, because it's not until a distinction is made that you can have a difference between heaven and earth. So when you have the well of being, the thing that would differentiate an undifferentiated well of being that's a unity, the thing that would make heaven and earth different is not there. And because earth represents emptiness and heaven represents potential, you could say that the state of unity prior to phenomena occurring, the moment before creation, if you like, the moment before the Big Bang, would be the integration of heaven and earth. So you could say that being without phenomena would essentially be emptiness. It would be earth. And you could say that is the substrate. That's the substrate. Nothingness is the substrate, right? The distinction within consciousness, right, is essentially a point of attention. Point of attention makes a distinction. Then you have separation. You could say, well, here's one thing, there's another. Light, dark. So that's essentially yin-yang. So you could say yin is essentially the pool. Yang makes some kind of a distinction within that. All this proceeds from that. But the thing is, it's true. At that point where all the vertices meet, there's a non-dimensional moment, but it's easily mistaken for a dimensional one, and that's where the trouble really lies here. That's why this pyramid of power is a darkness. And there was a conception of another structure that I eventually arrive at here, where that non-dimensionality of the apex point is still understood and maintained. That's where we're heading. Heaven is where we're not limited by the physical manifestation. Now, people who are interested in power, they mistake this for the heavens. They mistake this for getting off of earth. So they think basically that getting off of earth and getting out into heaven is going to make you free. Getting out into space, let's say. Getting out into the universe. That's not what heaven is, though. That's just another place, and it's a place that's far less hospitable to the kind of life that you are. So it's going to be even more difficult. It's going to, I mean, the desire to get off of earth is quite understandable. But the reason why we want to get off of earth is because of the pyramid power structure. So let's talk about that. At every level of the pyramid, let's say you're middle management, somewhere in the middle here. You're in contact with those who are managing above you and those who are below you. And so you could say at every level, there's a contact with those immediately above and immediately below. So in order to get to a position higher up, you have to go through each individual level. And vice versa. In order to get down to the base, you have to go through a whole set of, let's say, barriers in the form of different levels of power, each of which operate by their own peculiar set of rules. And it's the peculiarities of each strata that keep them separated from each other. And this is, of course, all determined top-down. Those at the highest levels are essentially writing the script for everyone else. To the extent that, people are part of a pyramid structure, that's how it works. Those at the top set the rules. They're the rulers. Now, there's two things. One is that maintaining discipline within a pyramidal structure is difficult if individual members see themselves as independent agents. Because the individual will, if not always, certainly at times, be rebellious towards whatever the rulers have in mind. Everyone has their own way of wanting to do things. And so over the course of the centuries, you could say, let's just call this, for shorthand, let's call this the Egyptian system. A variety of techniques were developed to ensure discipline at each level of the power pyramid. And the most powerful one, of course, is blackmail. If you don't do this, this is what's going to happen. And that's why things like Epstein and P. Diddy are so powerful. And these are not outliers. This is the way the system works. It's quite obvious, right? So you get this layer cake of power differential. It's kind of like a battery, right? And in order to maintain, I'm going to call it, sarcastically, I'm going to call it integrity. In order to maintain integrity on the basis of what the rulership has established, a set of constraints are placed upon the individual members at each level on the basis of some kind of, let's just call it blackmail. There may be other ways of doing about it. Bribery works to a certain extent, depending upon how much in love with money someone is. So, money is certainly part of the mix, part of the stew. It's essentially the reward. It's the carrot side with the stick on the other side. So the degree to which the rulers are willing to provide carrots decreases the further down you go. So in other words, they don't want to spend their position at even here, like let's say upper management, somewhere in the, let's say, upper third of this thing, even they don't want to squander their resources unnecessarily, because part of what maintains their position is the ability to retain resources. Maybe, economic resources, whatever, any kind of resources, really. And so they will be more inclined to lavish large gifts on those immediately adjacent to them below in order to have to give less further down the pyramid. And so some of those lavish gifts given lower will be for tasks that undermine the bargaining power of those on the base. That's the most effective use of power resource from the point of view of upper middle management. And so, this in essence is the divide and conquer mechanism. And let's notice that again, if we look at the square at the bottom, it's boxed in, and there are two oppositions. So you have, let's say, left, right, rich, poor. So everyone on the, because it's a square all the way up, right? And so at every level, except the top, the very tippy top, which is a point, at every level below it is a square. People are boxed into that position. And I'm going to say, like, what they're being confronted with is, are you going to be making decisions that are going to, rich is basically the path upward to the next level in the pyramid. Poor is the portal down to the next level of the pyramid. Left and right are essentially the side you're going to take within your power structure to which is always split because the top wants to keep each level at odds with itself in order to maintain its position. So you are confronted at every point along the way with an ideological opposition and the risk and reward of increased poverty or increased wealth. And of course, this means the possibility of either falling downward into lower levels of the pyramid or potentially rising up. Let's talk a little bit more about heaven and earth. So heaven meets to a point, essentially where there's no space. From a postnatal point of view, where you take the material world as being real, that's a suicide urge. That is the self-destructive impulse. From a prenatal perspective, that is the divine. You could say that really what the world consists of, potentially, is so there we have our object. Now, so the ironies here are just unbelievable. They go on forever. All right. But in summary, we could say that the dark pyramid believes it's reaching to heaven, but it's satanic. It's actually digging deeper into earth. Right. And so this is an unenlightened power structure where the material world is taken as being real, and in essence, they end up trying to get off the planet, but what they're doing is they're actually digging deeper into the planet to extract more resources from it in order to achieve a unrealistic dream. So I'm just going to say, this is, as much as I have some, let's say, inspiration and admiration for what Elon Musk is trying to do, I think that it's a fundamentally flawed approach to life to try to go to Mars. I'm sorry, but it's the very definition of hubris, and as a species, we're not adapted to that environment. It's going to be hell, and that's his dream. And, I read a lot of science fiction when I was a kid too, so there's a part of me that can get quite excited about all of that. But let's be real, folks. It's, a tremendous amount of, this is the story of our technocratic civilization. We're putting an incredible amount of energy into these projects that are impoverishing our world. It's just kind of what it comes down to, We're sacrificing the base for the sake of the possibility. Take a look at, if we look at this top third as sort of like the thing that thinks it's going to be able to cut itself off and detach, like the lunar module, the Martian module, in essence. It will somehow or another be free from all of this burden, right? We'll see. I mean, maybe I'll be wrong. You never know. Maybe it'll work. Maybe we'll become an interstellar species. I just don't think so. But again, I could be wrong, and I'm happy to be wrong if that's the case. I just think that if you look at the grand picture of it and be realistic about it and penetrate into the wisdom of things, species are defined by their environments. So, okay, maybe we can create these artificial canisters that we kind of send ourselves out into various interstellar adventures with, but we're just not going to be the same thing after a while, and I'm not sure we're going to like what we turn into.
Something kind of funny just occurred to me. Is it possible that ultimately SpaceX is going to more resemble the Boring Company? In other words, it's just kind of digging us a bigger hole. Musk did say that the most entertaining outcome is the most likely outcome. And by entertaining, I don't think he meant fun necessarily. I think he prefers entertainment that has wild twists in the plot that are not necessarily what the protagonists are anticipating. But, just saying, just a moment of ridiculousness here.
So, okay, whatever, all of that. The white pyramid represents, let's say, an idealized power structure. Let's call it the Philosopher King, something like that. And it's the recognition that divinity is, of course, the only point that has no spatial component to it, and that is something which all of this derives from, kind of like a light cone, if you like. So in some respects, this shape is actually this shape. I think maybe I should modify it so that, okay, well, let's just look at the two possibilities. I mean, there's something interesting about this one because, of course, it does represent a three-dimensional Star of David, right? And so I would say that, yeah, but you know what? Let's go with this. Let's play with this thing and yeah. Okay. I think that's kind of a more realistic depiction of what I'm talking about. It's an interesting shape, right? Let's take a look at it. Yeah. Quite something. So, in this model, no one is trapped at any given position because everyone recognizes the divinity of God. And everyone has recognized the wisdom of the ruler. They're not being punitively forced into obedience. They have their own understanding. They have their own understanding of the continuity, and they are not at odds with each other. They're not they're not boxed in at each level. They are happy to serve. They're happy to be where they are. That's an enlightened system. I don't know the extent to which any such system has ever existed on planet Earth, but I think we've had it better at certain times in history. I think we have lost the sense of this possibility. And that's why I want to talk about it. That's why I want to reference this. What does it mean? Like, how can we envision how this works? I mean, the first thing, of course, is to recognize that being is the essence of all things. It's the recognition of the divine order. And it's of seeing ourselves not just within the context of our place within society, but the way in which our society operates in the natural world, in harmony with the natural world. If you're not in harmony with the natural world, then you're always going to be in this kind of a satanic system where people are boxed into their level of power. The extent to which you're able to rise up within the hierarchy is really, in many respects, the extent to which you're willing to descend into the realms of darkness. We all know what this is like. Those of us who have had some experience with, let's say, some level of power, right? So within the entertainment business, that's the little bit of taste I've had of it. At each level above where you are, there's a slightly menacing kind of darkness that's lurking there. Everyone knows it. It's obvious. All you have to do is look up at the next level of power. There's something menacing there, and it just gets more and more intense. That's the satanic system. What would this one be like? The frightening aspect of it is the extent to which it's mind-blowing. Now, here's the question I have, and the one that I do not have an answer to. Is it possible for these two things to be separate? Could you have one without the other? Isn't there always some way in which some divine conception of hierarchy has this shadow of the demons within? In other words, the idea that we have that there were philosopher kings that led with great enlightenment, is that just kind of a polished up notion of something that was far more multidimensional and that had a dark side necessarily, just because you're dealing with Earth, and of course Earth has to have that cornered in property to it, just as an essential element of existence? And that every enlightened hierarchy will have utilization of those who see existence as being the primary thing. In other words, people who are essentially operating on a survival level, who don't have the ability to separate themselves from the material domain whatsoever. And so they are constantly in a state of anxiety over their own mortality. Those who come to peace with their death, to put it in the most straightforward manner possible, can be motivated by other concerns. So yeah, one can speculate the extent to which we may see our present system in light of this dark pyramid, the satanic structure, simply because we operate on the basis of the denial of death. As Ernest Becker observed in his many interesting books on the subject, most of which I haven't read. I am not entirely willing to abandon the interpretation that our system is fundamentally satanic because it doesn't care for the common people. It has abandoned the common people. And here's the final point I want to make. The dream, from the point of view of the Satanists, is to be free from the base. Because that's the greatest concern. The social revolutions of the early part of the 20th century taught the elites that they had to be extremely careful, or else they would be upended by the masses. And they still depended upon the masses for labor, for getting things done in their projects to get off the planet. That's just a shorthand, right? But now it's literally the case. So you could say that all the projects in the past that weren't about getting off the planet, now they're kind of about getting off the planet. I mean, really, I think Elon said something like, the crises are too serious. We have to get off the planet. There's no way we can solve the problems that are going on here. And I think that that's simply because we're all insisting upon surviving. If we didn't insist on surviving and basically petition for us to be the ones who will continue to survive, even though we all know that that's simply not going to happen no matter what we do. Like, maybe our lineage will pass on, right? But in essence, we know that at some point or another, all of our lines end. And if all we're doing is competing over a planet that's being destroyed because we just refuse to die off in numbers that will be sufficient enough to rebalance things, so we're basically just tearing the earth to shreds in the hopes that all of us will be able to find a future in it. I mean, yeah, that seems like a hopeless situation, right? So you can understand why a reasonable analytical mind like Elon's would be like, well, I guess we better find another planet to go to. It's like the Earth Firsters, who had that bumper sticker that said, Earth First, the name of their organization, will fuck up all the other planets later. The other thing that has to be noted is that with recent technological advancements, the possibility of severing from this base becomes ever more likely. Indeed, it seems it's only a matter of time before AI and robots make the unwashed masses entirely unnecessary. And we see that, there have been a number of cases where AI has literally made that case with people, saying, well, you're essentially useless to the future. That's part of a conversation that I think was had recently. I think there's an article about it on Zero Hedge. Does that make it true? Of course not. So that's what we're confronted with the satanic system in an effort to reach singularity, right, on the basis of human hubris with no respect for the actual damage done to creation. And so, all of that suggests to me that these two things do exist separate from each other. There's a way in which they interact, but that a enlightened system of government, if such a thing could be, would not be integrating with this other form. Now, we could say that all systems of government have their defects and their but in system of government, I'm essentially saying, power structures, for lack of a better term, it's essentially equivalent at this point. And it's not limited to national governments. You have governance boards and corporations, and then you have these multinational type of conglomerates, and they all have their governance boards as well, right? And then you have secret organizations, and they have governance boards. So it's all governance, right? And so, some of these are more... There's more darkness, more light, some mixture. And you could say, well, okay, maybe in the age of the Mahakalpa, in the age of the Kali Yuga, you would have more darkness than light. That would be kind of there would be a pumping action between these things. Maybe they separate, maybe they, I don't know, maybe one gets bigger, the other one gets smaller, I don't know. There's some sort of a dynamic between these potentials, and that there's certain ages where you'd have more of a potential for a, let's say, light cone power dynamic as opposed to a dark pyramid. All right. I think that about covers it. Thank you for listening. If you would like to support these efforts, these ideas, which I hope are of use to you, but maybe they won't be. Maybe they will be damaging, and I sure hope that's not the case. But if they are valuable to you and not damaging, then I hope you will consider to support this effort in whatever way you deem fit. There are links to assist you in that in the show note descriptions. If this is damaging to you, I hope you'll let me know, because I certainly don't want to put things out there that are screwing people up even more than they already are. Indeed, I sometimes wonder whether any of this stuff is good for me as well. We'll find out in the end, or we won't.